numbers yesterday went up to 2,073 for the day, which is the highest it's been, the first time it's broken 2,000 since the 18th of Feb. Okay, I'm reading some of Ridwan Suleiman's fascinating data that I always follow every single day. But also the positivity rate has gone up above, I think, just about 6%, which is a concern. So that point about the third wave, we don't know how big it's going to be, but there's signs that it's increasing. And I say that because it's Ramadan. I say that because people are going to the mosques in bigger numbers, spending longer time in the mosques than normal. And I'm saying that because we know the day of Eid comes up sometime next week, and you know exactly what I'm trying to say out of that. Be cautious. There are alarm bells that we need to take control of and manage it. Of course, all of that will be sorted out fine if we all can be vaccinated. I have a sister who lives in Canada, and she was saying between herself and her husband and the children, they're all vaccinated. But that's Canada. We're in South Africa. We're not in that situation. So if we're not vaccinated, why not? What's the story behind vaccination and what it really means? Okay. So with that in mind, I've got Fatima Hassan on the line. She has, pronounced very, very much on this issue around COVID vaccines and who does what and why they're doing it. So we thought, you know what, let's get the backstory on that. And there's some significant developments around that. She's the founder director of Health Justice Initiative, and that should tell you exactly what that means. So Fatima, appreciate your time. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thanks for having me on the show, Chef.
Thank you. I certainly like the title, Health Justice Initiative, because it really talks about the justice in health, and we sometimes take it all for granted. I take it, therefore, as an opening line with regard to vaccines. You are concerned there are some issues around vaccine rollouts that are rather unjust or, in effect, acts of injustice.
Yeah, so I think there's been a grave injustice that has happened in the world where the global south has basically been left without sufficient supplies of vaccines, where there has been the scientific knowledge to actually assist us to get us out of this pandemic within a very short period of time. And you mentioned the example of Canada. I mean, the government of Canada should be ashamed. It has blocked the TRIPS waiver. It has blocked our ability to manufacture and scale up vaccines so that we can vaccinate millions of people in our country. And, they also overbought supplies. They've been drawing supplies from the COVAX mechanism, which is meant to assist low-income countries. And they also entered into multiple advanced market commitments. So there's been, such a pernicious form of vaccine nationalism, which really explains in part why, your family members in Canada and my friends who are much younger in New York are getting vaccinated. But our parents and our aunts and our uncles and our friends who are over 75, even in South Africa, haven't even started to see.
So I think you raise an important point. So help me understand this. I mean, obviously, if a country gets vaccine, and we all want it, we want to get vaccinated ASAP. And I think in that sense, there's nothing wrong with Canada doing that. You're suggesting, therefore, that Canada and many other countries like that, they have secured vaccine well above their needs, and they're holding on to that. And as a result of that, there are other countries like South Africa and many others who are in desperate need. What's your understanding of that issue? What is wrong about that? Help us understand the balance or the imbalance around that.
So, one imagines that when you have a pandemic with the public health crisis of this nature, a fast, mutating virus that's highly transmissible, where you really need a vaccine to be able to try and mitigate the impact of the pandemic on millions of people around the world, all simultaneously at the same time. Very different, for example, to the HIV/AIDS crisis, where you have peaks in one country, but you may not have peaks in another country. And so the injustice really resides in two aspects. The one is that a lot of these wealthier countries basically entered into agreements where they hedge their bets. And so they overbought supplies from multiple vaccine manufacturers, which means that they've taken up all the available stock. Secondly, they also put money into the COVAX mechanism and are drawing from a limited pool of supplies from the COVAX mechanism. So when you have a public health crisis of a global nature, where there's scarcity of supplies, the WHO, for example, and other public health experts and scientists will tell you, you have to prioritize the vaccination or the availability of treatment based on public health needs. And so prioritization principles would be that all healthcare workers around the world first get the vaccine. Then you'd have people over 75. And so you would share the limited supplies equitably and equally, and that's part of the notion of health justice, right? Or the injustice that we see. Or what you also do at the same time is you try and scale up supplies. And how do you scale up supplies? You tell the monopoly rights holders, or you tell the companies that have the knowledge or that have claimed the ID to share that knowledge and to share that know-how. So you do two things at the same time. You share whatever available doses there are equitably, and so you don't rely on nationalistic tendencies, but you also assist other countries who don't have access to immediate supplies to start scaling up. I mean,
so they're two important issues. We'll get to intellectual property because there's been breaking developments last night from the USA, which we'll touch on in a moment. So let's stay with the country part firstly, right? So this notion of we all one world, we share together. I mean, that's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
You're suggesting that the country that you live in will determine how safe you are with regards to the risks around COVID, because those countries are holding on to things. So can anything happen to break that? Can WHO can they go beyond talking? United Nations, can they do that sort of thing, or is it really just talk and they can't do much about it? They can just voice an opposition to it.
So I think, that question is really great because it gets to the heart of the issue around vaccine access around the world. Is that instead of the World Health Organization, or instead of sovereign governments and duly elected governments determining the pace and the scale of the rollout of vaccines and, the availability of supplies, what you have is a handful of CEOs of some multinational companies determining all of that. And certainly we've seen that in South Africa. So the ability and speed within which a lot of countries in Africa, what we call in the global south, low-income countries as well, to be able to access sufficient supplies and really rapidly roll out vaccination programs was very highly dependent on the conduct of the pharmaceutical companies, who incidentally, Ashraf, their research was co-funded by the public. There was a lot of government support for accelerated vaccine research, but quite early on when the pandemic was declared, governments around the world realized that this was quite a grave situation, and aside from the fact that it was having a bottom line impact on the world economy, that they needed to get the entire world basically out of this pandemic because of the lockdown and restrictions and just the impact it was having on mortality and mobility. So the way you break that, and I think that when you talked about what happened last night, and something that we're very sort of excited about, because it's just the first step in a long journey now, and we've been calling for it since last year, was to basically share the knowledge and the know-how through what we called a waiver of intellectual property protections through what's called the TRIPS agreement, which is located in the World Trade Organization. So now you and I, in a pandemic, would think the World Health Organization should have the mandate to solve this. A national government should be able to do this. Instead, what has happened with this pandemic, which has happened with all other epidemics as well, because medicines are still treated as a commodity, is the World Trade Organization, a trade body that is in charge of trade rules, is basically has all the power. And so, I've argued before, we've been in a hostage situation, a hostage to a number of vaccine manufacturers, and we're hostage to the rules of the World Trade Organization. And that's where the TRIPS waiver is located. And last night, something significant happened. So since October last year, when the South African and Indian governments have been asking for the TRIPS waiver, a temporary suspension of intellectual property protections, not just the patents, all of the IP, for COVID-19 related technologies, just for the duration of the pandemic, so that we can actually vaccinate everybody and everybody can get tested on time, etc., and everybody can get treated on time. And a handful of countries, only a handful, about 11 of them, have been blocking the waiver. Very powerful countries, the ones who've overbought supplies, the ones that have already started vaccinating young people, and in some cases even vaccinating children now, including the US. And last night, for the first time, the Biden administration basically unequivocally came out and they said they support the relaxation of intellectual property in this pandemic in relation to vaccines, and they're actually going to support the negotiations now at the WTO on the TRIPS waiver.
And the USA being what they are, I mean, that could actually spark up a tipping point because of just their economic muscle and political muscle, I would think, right? So you're saying, so you're saying there are pharmaceutical companies. I'm just thinking at the top of my head, AstraZeneca, the J&J, and so on, and all of them, right? And all of them, of course, produce or manufacture, right? And then sell to countries or sell to organizations or whatever around the world. And you're saying, when we talk about this waiver, right? You're saying that they must. I'm just thinking about a cooking recipe because we're talking about Zuleka Maya just now. That for the duration of the pandemic, right, they must pass on the recipe to others so that other companies and organizations in those countries can also manufacture, which will actually speed up the process of more people getting it. Is that the essence of what you're saying?
So what normally happens in a pandemic when billions of people need access to a particular life-saving intervention and you only have a handful of companies making the supplies, then you're going to have supply bottlenecks. We've just seen this in South Africa with the Johnson & Johnson supplies. Because they've only given aspirin one fill and finish license, for example, and they don't have multiple manufacturers, the contamination that happened at a US plant has basically affected the delivery for South Africa's vaccination rollout, which now has an impact on our ability to vaccinate people in rural parts, because the Johnson & Johnson doses were actually earmarked for people in rural parts of our country, because it's one dose and doesn't have, cold storage requirements. Pfizer, for example, which is the other pillar of our vaccination program, just in South Africa, I'm not even talking about the rest of the world, the supplies are coming in a drip feed fashion. Every month you're getting maybe 250,000, 500,000. I mean, we need to vaccinate about, at least 20 million people. So if they are behind their production targets, and all of them are behind their production targets, they said they were going to be able to produce billions of doses in 2021. It's already May. That's very unlikely to happen because of a number of supply chains and blockages, around the world. So Australia is facing a supply crisis. The EU is facing a supply crisis. And I think that what happened in the US is when the Biden administration saw firsthand, we all saw it on national television, what was happening in India, what's currently happening in Nepal, in Sri Lanka. Then you just basically can't continue justifying why you would be opposed to the sharing of knowledge and through the sharing of a greater scale-up of manufacturing. Obviously, it's not going to happen overnight. You have to invest in manufacturing capacity. But if you, for example, say to me as a local manufacturer, invest in this capacity, set up a manufacturing plant, I'm not going to do that until I have an assurance that I'm not going to violate some intellectual property rule. I'm not going to be sued. I'm not going to be taken to court. There has to be certainty that I'm protected, and then I will make that investment.
And I understand I understand the shares with many of these big companies sort of dropped yesterday on the basis of the Biden administration announcement, right? So, which leaves me with this last point. I mean, pharmaceutical companies, yes, they service mankind. Yes, they try and provide healthcare to all of us. But at their core, in their business of serving, they're out of business. So they may argue, if we're not going to make a profit now, when will we make a profit? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so, that's what we heard in HIV. So firstly, let's just aggregate that particular argument, right? The first is that until we have full disclosure of the research and development costs of the pharmaceutical companies, especially in relation to the vaccine research, then, we have to take that with a pinch of salt. Because what we do know, the evidence that we do have, is at least $10 billion was invested through public resources for accelerated vaccine research. So the risk is actually carried by, for example, US public funds, by the German government, by the UK government. A lot of public money was actually used to support the vaccine research, including public participation in the vaccine trials. The mRNA technologies actually rely on technologies that were developed by public scientists and public institutions before. So there's also a big question about who actually owns the IP. We argue in the case of Moderna, the US government owns the IP and not the company, right? So that's a whole complex set of issues about the industry being notorious in saying that it has spent all the money in the innovation or in the research, but actually when you disaggregate that.
Well, many may say, sorry, carry on.
Nobody is saying you shouldn't make a profit. You should make a reasonable profit. So the waiver is not expropriation. It's not taking away your property without compensation. There will be royalties. You will make a lot of money in the end if you sell billions of doses. Certainly what happened with generic versions of ARV. And while it initially dipped because people weren't sure what that announcement was, by the end of, I think, the closing around the way in which their stock market worked, their price had actually rebound to kind of like normal levels. So the question is, are you allowed to make an excessive profit in a pandemic? Because that's pandemic gouging. Are you allowed to hoard knowledge in a pandemic?
Well,
and we're not dealing with cars, right? We're dealing with medicine.
So I'm thinking of that. I'm going to think about it, and I'll end with this. I'm thinking about people in a boat trying to get to shore and safety, and we all are in that boat. We need to be rowing in the same direction. And amongst all of us, one of them are short of oars, and somebody else is selling us oars, and they're selling at a higher price. Something along that line, and that's where it is. Fatima Hassan, just the last thing here in 15 seconds. What do you want to see happen now?
So the negotiations have to be expedited. We really don't have time on our hands because people are literally getting sick and dying all around the world, and we certainly need to avoid as much death as we can. We are in a public health global crisis, and we need to act accordingly. And the negotiations have to be transparent and open. And we're really looking to the UK and the EU and Australia and Canada, all the countries that normally lecture us about rules and democracy and human rights, for them to stop blocking the waiver and to actually, follow the US administration's lead and actually start supporting the waivers so that we can get vaccines in many people's arms.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Fatima Hassan, thank you for your time and great work that you've done in terms of amplifying this cause, certainly in South Africa, and it's not gone unnoticed. Fatima Hassan is the founder, director of the Health Justice Initiative. Check it out, healthjusticeinitiative.org.za, but follow her on Twitter as well, _HassanF. Do not miss what she has to say. It's really, really important. What also is important is what Zuleika Mayat has to say, and she's in the hot seat, and I'm with her for the next 30 minutes or so coming up next.
This Ramadan,